Let's talk about that now with DA Member of Parliament Emma Powell, who's joining us tonight on News at Prime. A very good evening to you, ma'am. Thank you so much for your time. I wonder if you're hearing anything different from what government has said on tape and what is being reported around whether or not there's a consideration, a legitimate consideration around giving up the right to host the BRICS gathering.
Evening, thanks for having me. So this is a rapidly evolving and moving situation, and what is clear is that the ANC are in a desperate scramble to avoid their obligations in terms of international law. We know that the Interministerial Committee that has been headed by Paul Mashatile has already received one legal opinion. They are now in the process of obtaining a second legal opinion. Earlier this week, Minister Naledi Pandor gazetted a signed copy of the Diplomatic Immunities and Privileges Act that essentially provides immunity to visiting heads of state. DIRCO quickly moved to counter any conjecture that this would essentially allow the ANC or government to bypass its obligations to arrest Putin. And I think that what's now going on in the background, in the aftermath of the DA having launched a court challenge on Monday, is that serious discussions are underway to find an alternative venue for the summit to be held.
And you are going to go to court as the DA preemptively, trying to get the court to put some form of obligation on the South African state to say that it will indeed arrest Vladimir Putin should he land in this country in August. If you are not successful on that score, what would you do on that day in August if a Russian jet landed carrying Vladimir Putin? And I ask that question because the Western Cape, where the DA is in charge, had said, well, if he lands there, he'd be arrested. I don't know how exactly that's going to work. He would land in Gauteng at this point, by all indications. So where would it leave the DA?
So there is already precedent following the 2015 al-Bashir matter, where that matter went up to the Supreme Court of Appeal, and that court ruled that in terms of South Africa's signatory to the Rome Statute, as well as our domesticated implementation act, that South Africa indeed has an obligation to arrest individuals who are indicted by the ICC. So the steps that the DA are taking is to obtain a declaratory order that South Africa will indeed uphold its legal obligations. Now, South Africa is in a difficult situation because of the ANC's dalliance with the Kremlin. I certainly can't speak on behalf of the Premier of the Western Cape. I don't believe that that's currently even relevant, given that the summit is taking place in Johannesburg. South Africa at present has got two options. The first option is that we uninvite Vladimir Putin from visiting South Africa, and the second is that we move the conference to a different venue, such as a neighboring country, China or Mozambique. South Africa is currently party to the Rome Statute. There is a 12-month notice period that must be given in terms of South Africa withdrawing from that, and we have an implementation act. So the ANC are in a corner, and I think that that's why they're in this desperate scramble. DIRCO's comments earlier this week, I think, have nailed their colors as the department to the mast to say we have an obligation to arrest Putin. It's not the nation, it's not South Africa, it's not the Department of International Relations and Cooperation that are trying to avoid this obligation. It is the ANC. So our court action is essentially to get a declarative to say that in terms of the courts, Putin must be arrested, and that's why this desperate scramble to now move the summit is taking place.
Are you not, as the DA, grandstanding, though, with this preemptive strike, considering that there was already a court decision that said that this country was wrong to have not detained a foreign head of state who'd arrived in South Africa on an ICC arrest warrant that was not effected on our soil? So why is this necessary?
I don't think that it would be correct to say that the DA is grandstanding. We're the official opposition, and we have an obligation to hold government to account in terms of executing their functions and their obligations in terms of international law. Now, we know that al-Bashir was allowed to escape the or the legal obligation that this nation had to arrest him because he forms part of the African Brotherhood of Leaders. And so what the DA is doing is we are getting a preemptive declarative from the court to ensure that that situation doesn't repeat itself. And I think at this point it's important to explain to South Africans why the situation is so critical, because South Africa's economic, trade and domestic interests are at risk. And if you'll just give me 30 seconds to outline why that is. If we look at foreign direct investment stocks into South Africa, we know that in recent years, 77% of FDI stock into South Africa came from the European Union, the United Kingdom, and the United States. China and Russia, on the other hand, accounted for a mere 6.2%. Currently, the EU and the UK, Western nations, account for 47% of South Africa's exports. Russia, conversely, accounts for as little as 0.3% of our trade ties. So in cozying up to their cadres in the Kremlin, as well as an alleged war criminal, Vladimir Putin, South Africa risks jeopardizing our very strategic and important relationships with Western trading partners that create jobs in South Africa and put food on the table for ordinary South Africans.
Would you agree at the very least, though, that some of those very Western nations who do want Putin to face the International Criminal Court or charges at the ICC are themselves not exactly of the best moral standing, because if you go through their records, they too have made friends with people who are heads of state that it could easily be argued are warlords or guilty of war crimes at some level or human rights violations in the worst manner?
I don't think that it is prudent to mount a comparative analysis. I think that would be intellectually dishonest in the context of us as the Democratic Alliance trying to protect South Africa's reputation in the global community, our status as a leader on the African continent, and our obligations in terms of law. Regardless of the actions of other nation states or conjecture or counter-arguments that may be mounted against countries in the West, I represent a portion of the people of South Africa. I sit in Parliament and I have a duty, a constitutional obligation to hold the executive to account and to make sure that we follow the laws. And so my goal here is to protect South Africa's economic and domestic interests, to put the South African people first, and to say, well, because the West have been involved in X, Y, or Z, South Africa can do the same. That's an intellectually dishonest argument, and it ultimately fails the people of South Africa.
But you agree that the West has indeed made, quote-unquote, dodgy friends itself, to put it mildly?
I think that there have indeed been missteps along the way, and I think that we can have very pointed conversations about where those missteps have occurred. This conversation, however, is about South Africa and South Africa's interests, our obligations in terms of international law, and who we are as a nation, what we stand for, what we fought for. And what is so disappointing is to see that some of the very same people that sat around the table at the CODESA negotiations ahead of the dawn of South Africa's democracy, who helped to draft our constitution, principles such as respecting territorial sovereignty, upholding the rule of law, ensuring that people's human rights are protected, these same leaders are now making decisions to protect their party political interests, their party political funding streams that are putting South African jobs at risk and that risk essentially us losing our economic standing on the African continent and us being relegated to the dustbin of history or the basket of deplorables along with countries who cozy up to warlords like Iran and North Korea. And that's a big problem, not just for us as the DA, but for us as South Africans. And we should all be speaking out about what's currently going on.
Is the DA party political position that we should align with the West at all times, not only because of the trade benefits, but also broader interests related to what the West wants to do and achieve? Is that the DA party political position?
Absolutely not. The DA's foreign policy position is that we pursue relationships. Those are trade relationships, and those are bilateral and multilateral relationships that ensure South Africa's economic growth, Our foreign policy position is based on a rules-based international order, respecting and upholding our constitutional values and our engagements with other nation states. It's absolutely not a case of saying we should engage in relationships with the global north or the west at the expense of the global south. I think that there's huge economic benefit to be derived from multilateral relations with a variety of countries that don't necessarily or not constitute in terms of any outright alignment to what you or I would term the West. So to answer your question in short, no, that's certainly not the DA's position. The DA's position is let's put South Africa first, but at the same time, let's do so using our constitution as the bedrock of our foreign policy positions and engagements.
So with that in mind, in putting South Africa first, should we look first at financial benefit or human rights records?
So the two, I think, are not mutually exclusive. The two are interlinked. So we need to pursue economic interests with nations that are mutually beneficial. But where nations are committing human rights atrocities, for example, Russia, Vladimir Putin having been accused of war crimes concerning the abduction and deportation of children. We've had the General Assembly at the United Nations have condemned that. I think that in terms of situations such as that, we absolutely need to put the human rights situation ahead of our measly 0.3% trade that we do with the nation.
There's plenty for us to unpick on that theme, but unfortunately we do have to go for now. Emma Powell from the DA, thank you for your time.